I'm thrilled to be here, and I thank Uday and Gary and the whole committee on globalization for inviting me. It's already been a fun day. This is a brand new talk, so that's exciting for me always. It's also a little nerve-wracking. So you'll be the first people to hear it, and I look forward to learning where I went wrong and having a good discussion about it. And it's called, as Uday said, globalization and the human condition. I was born in New York City, but did not grow up here. So when I moved back to the city after extended stays in small-town Western Massachusetts, post-communist Moscow, bike-friendly Frankfurt, and the People's Republic of Berkeley, I was troubled. I was shocked when my tea and bagel came in a paper bag inside a plastic bag filled with plastic utensils and unwanted condiments. I was also struck by the proliferation of chain stores. So I attended my local community board meeting. I made my case to work as a community to prefer local enterprises, businesses with owners present who bring neighborliness and humanity to daily life. To polite refusal, I was told that there were national and international laws, plus a Supreme Court decision, that forbid discrimination against chain stores. In essence, I was told that resistance was futile. Former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill is well known for saying, all politics is local. It turns out he was right. Past tense. Now it is global. Today, the truism that politics is global conceals a complicated reality. It may be global rules and regulations that one day prohibit my local deli from wrapping every order in multiple levels of plastic. And yet those same rules may so increase the cost and complexity of doing business that my local deli will be replaced by a multinational chain supported by an army of lawyers, lobbyists, and a compliance department. Globalization has advantages and it has costs, and we must take care to avoid simple-minded censure as well as uncritical support. Today I want to talk about what globalization means for human beings as political beings. When Aristotle names humans, zoon, logon, echon, the animals who have logos, or thinking, or speech, or politics, he emphasizes that we are beings who reason, we speak, we act in ways that are unexpected, non-habitual, and surprising. And as thinking, speaking, and acting beings, we come together with others to talk and act, to bring into being something miraculous, a common world through which we jointly, as a political community, pursue our collective dreams and ideals. Political being is, in this sense, part of humanity itself. Globalization offers one kind of a common world. When we meet at the water cooler and speak of the news from Egypt and Afghanistan, we have the pictures and voices from those places in our eyes and ears. When we go to the market and purchase plums in the dead of winter, we taste globally, senseless of the remoteness of climates. Just this week in the New York Times, Douglas Copeland introduced the term translit, or at least for me, a new genre of novels that cross history without being historical and span geography without changing psychic place. Facebook, email, and cell phone show me how my friends around the world are doing, in the moment, meaning that absence no longer marks the passage of time. Globalization then can be depoliticizing. It connects us to ever greater circles of contacts, colleagues, and acquaintances, but leaves us with fewer friends, neighbors, and comrades. It is the way the world appears when, quote, all remoteness in time and space contracts. This formulation is from Heidegger's lecture Das Ding, and politically the retreat of distance and absence means that borders are anachronistic. Religious and racial boundaries are fading. Even boundaries between humans and animals, and even between humans and machines, are increasingly seen as arbitrary. I am always tickled with the new civil rights movements that I've been encountering recently, which is the right for people to marry cyborgs or robots. The manifold and plural world in which we have lived for millennia, a world of boundaries, limits, and distinctions, is becoming unbounded, unlimited, and unitary. In Heidegger's words, quote, all is washed together in uniform distancelessness. Just take the example of my failed effort to enlist my community board's support to oppose chain stores. It is one thing to gather with my neighbors and talk over how we want our community to look and feel. But it is another project altogether to take on international bureaucracies and regulations. Not only do I lack the resources to do so, I lack the will. I see the point in getting to know my neighbors, to talk with them, and build a common sense amongst them. No such thing is possible on a truly global level. The sort of common world that we can build on a global level is qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from the kinds of shared worlds we experience in smaller settings. It is simply impossible to recreate the New England town meeting in New York City, let alone the United States of America or the world. While globalization spawns global political institutions, and while it makes use of weakened local institutions of enforcement, its thrust is to overwhelm the experience of a shared world that we as citizens can work together to bring into being. I am, of course, not the first person to feel that global democracy has yielded, in Simon Critchley's words, massive political disappointment. We must confront the reality of the global retrenchment of our political humanity and not simply wish it away. We must, in other words, reconcile ourselves to our reality if we have any hope of resisting it. Towards that project of confronting, reconciling, and resisting the global practice of politics, I want to talk about two practices of globalized politics. First, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the rise of global anarchist movement and the rise of a global anarchist movement. And second, the meteoric rise of international human rights and an increasing importance of international humanitarian law. Both of these movements are embraced by critics of globalization. They are idealist movements, and their practitioners oppose and resist the worst effects of a globalized economy. And yet both these idealistic anti-globalization movements are avowedly global. Moreover, and this is what I want to argue in my talk today, both global anarchism and international human rights fail in complicated ways as political responses to the political challenges globalization poses to human beings. The conflict between globalization and humanism has been at the very forefront of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Consider, for example, the now iconic poster that announced the original call for the protest. I don't know if we passed this around, but I'm sure many of you, most of you if not, have seen it. The poster was created and disseminated by Adbusters, a Canadian media and anti-advertising group. It shows a charging bull, iconic to the world of finance, gracefully ridden by a female dancer in front of a surging crowd wearing gas masks and brandishing batons. Smoke fills the air. It is an image of revolution, but what does the revolution call for? Well, the poster suggests a number of answers. Dance, the power of grace and beauty over brawn, the escape from unrestrained capitalism and the worship of money, the resistance to cold calculation and a return to more spiritual values. The bull, a metaphor for animalistic, willful, and irrational system of global finance, recalls another famous metaphor, namely Immanuel Kant's description of a despotic state as a mere machine, a hand grinder in Kant's 18th century imagery. The point is that the world of finance is like both state and machine, governed by an absolute and seemingly unstoppable will that can make mincemeat of individuals. And yet, importantly, there is a noticeable absence in the Occupy Wall Street poster, at least as I read it, and it's not always so clear, namely the state, be it despotic or democratic. Whereas Kant portrays the despotic state as a violent meat grinder, the Occupy Wall Street imagery leaves the state out. We have the crowd, the financial system, and the individual, but the state seems not to appear. In lieu of the machine of state, we have the voracious bull of globalized financial capital. The anti-finance, anarchic, and non-state aspects of Occupy Wall Street have been well observed. Less visible, however, has been the globalized core of Occupy Wall Street. Of course, many connected it to the Arab Spring and the Tel Aviv summer, but few, at least as I understand it, who are outside the movement, have understood the deep connection between Occupy Wall Street and the globalized network of anarchist groups like People's Global Action, the Zapatistas in Chiapas, the landless workers movement in Brazil, and the Italian Yabasta protesters in their white Michelin men's suits. Indeed, far too often, Occupy Wall Street is portrayed by supporters and opponents as opposed to globalization. The idea that Occupy Wall Street is an anti-globalization movement is tied, I think, to a one-sided understanding of globalization as economic integration. A fuller appreciation of globalization must also account for the political globalization of Occupy Wall Street. Now, one person who gets this and who I'm going to rely on, and so I'm not talking about anarchism in general, but a specific presentation of it, is David Graeber. Many of you have heard of him. He published an essay in Adbusters called Awaiting the Magical Spark in the same issue in which Adbusters put out its call for Occupy Wall Street. He's become somewhat legendary, for truth or not, I don't know, for having attended the first General Assembly on Bowling Green, being upset with the traditional protest nature of it, and forming a split General Assembly on the other side of the park with one or two friends that became the General Assembly that actually planned the Occupy Wall Street occupation. In addition, in 2009, Graeber published Direct Action, an ethnography, a nearly 600-page book that he calls a work of ethnography with, quote, no particular argument. In the best ethnographic tradition, rich narratives and suggestive details overwhelm systematic analysis. Most importantly, however, Graeber has a story to tell, and in brief outline it is this. First, in the latter half of the 20th century, international capitalism was transforming itself into a revolutionary force. Graeber calls this the rise of utopian right-wing radical free market politics, namely the rise of free market politics out of the Chicago School of Economics, which saw welfare states as a threat to freedom. Then came, in the second move, the rhetoric of globalization. There emerged, quote, the first genuinely planetary bureaucratic system in human history, which comprises the UN, WTO, IMF, World Bank, NAFTA, EU, and others. And all of this, Graeber marvels, was, quote, achieved through an ideology of radical individualism, namely free market capitalism. Third, and this is the most important part, is the turning point when he argues the left was reborn with the Zapatista rebellion in the Mexican state of Chiapas. The Zapatistas rejected the old-fashioned guerrilla strategy of seizing state control through armed struggle in favor of a call for the creation of autonomous, democratic, self-governing communities in alliance with a global network of like-minded democratic revolutionaries around the world. Embracing values, quote, both more locally and on a planetary scale, the Zapatistas gave birth to a globalized anti-globalization movement. The term anti-globalization is, Graeber writes, a misnomer and an invention of the media. Instead, the Zapatistas aimed at a genuine democratic form of globalization. The final phase of Graeber's story is the rise of anarchist groups who embrace the effacement of all international borders, reject the participation of political parties or any group whose purpose was to become a government, and above all, seek to, quote, put nonviolent direct action back on the world stage as a force for global revolution. Now, it's an interesting alternative political history of the last 50 years. But I'm most interested in his description, his ethnographic description of direct action. The appeal of direct action, as Graeber understands it, is to act and live amidst, and here I'm going to be quoting a lot, but just reading, so bear with me, is to live amidst what he calls the experience of freedom. Since the experience of freedom is infectious, quote, anyone who takes part in direct action is likely to be permanently transformed by the experience and want more. I think Occupy Wall Street was, to a certain degree, proof of that. The point of anarchist direct action is not to change the policy of states or to take over institutions. It is to create temporary bubbles of autonomy that, quote, and that's a quote, and also must gradually turn into permanent free communities. I want to give us some attention to these temporary bubbles of autonomy that help to create, quote, situations of dual power, spaces of freedom from the state. The effort is, in the end, to institutionalize this experience, this giddy realignment of imaginative power through direct action. Importantly, direct actions seek rebellion, not revolution. They seek what may be called moments of insurrection that seeks to make space for individual radicalism, not to build a new political order. As Graeber concludes, Even those who labor to create the conditions for insurrection do not see them as making fundamental breaks in reality, but more as something almost along the lines of momentary advertisements, or better, foretastes, experiences of visionary inspiration for a much slower, painstaking effort to create alternatives. The point, as I understand Graeber's anarchism, and it's one particular anarchism, is that it aims fundamentally at momentary advertisements, at temporary bubbles of autonomy, and at a process of purification. Not only the state, but even federations, villages, and authorities are all types to be rejected. And in their place, modern anarchism, as Graeber ethnographically presents it, elevates the experience of rebellion, the purification of radical individuality, and the momentary appearance of apparent liberation. As a global movement aiming at momentary advertisements of purified individualism and rebellion, anarchism becomes a lifestyle. The continuing appeal of Emma Goldman's call for beer and revolution reflects the emergence of individualistic anarchism as a lifestyle choice. The anarchist chooses a life on the dangerous border of criminality and violence, compensated by the conviction that such a life is more free and thus more meaningful than a traditional bourgeois life of family, work, and citizenship. As an admittedly radical lifestyle, anarchism is, in the words of Slavoj Žižek, a revolt which poses no effective threat. Anarchism, in its contemporary guise, is a global movement that feeds upon the very globalized world that it both resists and embraces. Now, this is not all about critiquing or not anarchism in general, but I'm trying to think about his understanding of these spaces of freedom. And interestingly enough, the language of anarchism's spaces of freedom, at least superficially, accords with Hannah Arendt, who also seeks to identify what she calls spaces of freedom in a global world. In her book, On Revolution, Arendt also argues that we need such spaces to preserve freedom in modern politics. Arendt names freedom an experience. Freedom, she writes, is experienced in the process of acting and nothing else. As for Graeber, acting freely is at the heart of Arendt's politics. But Arendt and Graeber mean different things by spaces of freedom. Beyond rebellion, human freedom, the freedom of human beings, is the coincidence of acting and creating. Human freedom is the exhilarating awareness of the human capacity of beginning that Arendt insists is a part of human freedom and that Graeber's anarchist freedom ignores. As an act of foundation and creation, free acts beckon others to join in a common project of beginning a new story, a new chapter in a tale. Freedom is the power to constitute new institutions and new political orders. Freedom, therefore, is tied to revolution. Now, Arendt's revolutionary idea of freedom influences her response to the loss of freedom in modern liberal democracies. The loss of freedom follows from the fact that the new revolutionary republics in the 19th century left no space for the very freedom that brought the 18th century revolutions about in the first place. Paradoxically, the revolutionary spirit, once successful, could no longer hold together its antagonistic forces of stable foundation on the one hand and destructive creation on the other. In response to this loss of the spaces of freedom, Arendt asks a question. What kind of institutional spaces could potentially preserve a place for the revolutionary spirit within a republic? And she offers two answers. First, she bemoans that the U.S. founders failed to incorporate the townships and the town hall meeting into the Constitution. The town hall meetings, like the ward system that Thomas Jefferson proposed and called the salvation of the Republic, were spaces of freedom in Arendt's book. The possibility of public freedom necessitates, she argues, institutionally recognized forums for free action in which the free citizen manifests himself or herself to others. Only a system of wards or town councils could preserve for citizens the experience of active participation in public business. And only daily engagements with public business could keep alive, and this is, I think, the key for her and for me, could keep alive in citizens the sense of a public and common purpose, and thus fight against the tendency toward the victory of private interests in politics. A tendency that, as Montesquieu knew so well, is the cause of the corruption and degeneracy of all Republican forms of government. Now, the second space of freedom that Arendt mentions is the Constitution and its institutional embodiment in the Supreme Court. This is the one that's less talked about because it has less the participatory democracy angle, which is where a lot of people have turned to in Arendt, and here's more the legal angle, but I find it compelling and important. When Arendt speaks of the Constitution as a space of freedom, she alludes to the founders' emulation of ancient Rome. In Rome, the Senate's authority was not founded upon its claim to democratic representation. Instead, the Roman Senate ruled through its claim to be spiritually connected with the city's original founders. The senators, she insists, reincarnated the ancestors, it's a fascinating term, and the founding fathers. Whatever the Senate did, it did as a continuation of the founding spirit of Rome, which it possessed not as representatives of a collective will, sort of Hobbesian will, a will idea of the government, but as the present incarnation of a past and yet still vibrant foundational moment. Because the Supreme Court was, in Woodrow Wilson's phrase, a kind of constitutional assembly in continuous session, the court, in Arendt's account, bases its authority on a reverence for, and its claim to be reenacting, the founding experience of the nation. It is this intimate weaving of foundation, augmentation, and conservation into a single cloak of constitutional authority that Arendt understands to be the most important single notion which the American Revolution adopted. Like Roman senators, the court justices remain at all times founders, constantly reimagining constitutional debate, who thus regularly experience the revolutionary thrill of foundation and beginning. The court was, Arendt saw, a constitutionally authorized space of revolutionary freedom. And even if not everyone in the country was on the court, obviously, it served as an example for the kind of free debate and articulation of issues that people should engage in the nation. This is her argument of why it's so important. It is telling that in our globalized world, Graeber and Arendt both seek spaces of freedom amidst the failure of liberal and democratic politics. But their responses to depoliticization are different. Graeber's spaces of freedom are global. They are divorced from a public realm and from any effort to build a common politics. The problem is not that the anarchists refuse to make demands, a position that I think is well justified by a need to avoid falling back into a politics of private interest. The problem is that the anarchists' refusal of a common political world, except as a matter of rebellion, and their ability to articulate a genuinely public interest that could counter a corrupt politics of self-interest. Arendt, on the other hand, reminds us that human freedom is more than simply an escape from authority. Human freedom means also the ability to constitute institutions and polities that will last beyond our mortal lifespans. As distinguished from rebellion, Arendtian ideas of human freedom are revolutionary. Human freedom must create and found institutions, which is why freedom must be political freedom, and must seek to constitute, invigorate, and enliven legal and political communities. So let me just recap where I am after part one of the paper. To ask after the relation between globalization and humanism, I turned to Occupy Wall Street as an example of globalized anti-globalization movement, and a particular version of Occupy Wall Street given by Mr. Graeber. The turn to anarchism is born from a frustration at the failure of politics to realize the ideals of freedom and justice. The anarchist movements are global. They embrace actions and protests that offer an experience of freedom. Anarchism seeks spaces of freedom as spaces of rebellion. Anarchism thus denies not only the human need to be part of a given world of traditions and customs, but also the human desire to found and create new stories and new polities that will resist private interests and erect public worlds that counteract the frailty of human existence. While Arendt shares the anarchist insight into the need for spaces of freedom to counteract the passivity of liberal politics, she understands that spaces of freedom must not simply rebel against society, but also work to revolutionize and thus refound the political order that can accommodate the experience of freedom. It is precisely Arendt's insistence that freedom be found in political community that underlies her suspicion of human rights. Human rights imagine humans to have a certain dignity simply on account of our humanity. Because human rights abstracts humans from our membership or belonging to any nation, state, or religion, human rights are a symptom and cause of the way that globalized human beings are set loose from their concrete realities and unmoored from their situated existence. So I'd like now to turn to human rights as my second example of a globalized response to the dangers of globalization and what those dangers pose to human being as political being. The rise to prominence of human rights is, like anarchism, a corollary of our globalized world. This is true temporally as well as intellectually. As Sam Moyn has persuasively shown, human rights and globalization break onto the world scene at the same time, in the 1970s and 80s. Amnesty International wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1977, and according to Moyn, the phrase human rights, a rarity in English before 1940 and used sparingly thereafter, explodes into the popular consciousness after 1977. In 1977, the word human rights were used in the New York Times 5 times more than in any prior year. In Moyn's telling, the moral world changed in 1977. The moral world has indeed changed. Just consider, for example, the carnage of the last year in Syria. The world is appalled, and rightly so. Even China and Russia must blanch at what Butcher Assad has done. And they agree wholeheartedly to send bandages and medicine to the people in alms. But why is the revolution in Syria a human rights issue at all? It is either a rebellion or a revolution. It calls for a political judgment about whether we should support a brutal but stable dictator or those seeking his ouster. The Syrian fighters actually are not requesting medicines and safe areas. They want weapons and no-fly zones. Responsible political debate would engage these questions and ask whether we should and how we should assist the revolutionaries. But that is not happening. We are politically paralyzed, unable or unwilling to act, and so lost, we retreat to the language of human rights. Human rights fits our globalized world perfectly. It is the lowest common denominator of world opinion, that which everyone can agree to without effort, thought, or judgment. The loss of political judgment is in fact the hallmark of humanitarian thinking. As Roni Brauman, former president of Doctors Without Borders, reminds us, humanitarian action does not choose between victims. The question whether to defend Syrian sovereignty or the claims of the rebels is deferred indefinitely, except as a matter of practical humanitarianism. The rise of humanitarianism reflects our unwillingness to take political stands. It is essentially nothing other than the symptom of a certain inability of politics to come to terms with itself with regard to its specific political responsibilities. Even anti-poverty campaigns are reimagined within humanitarian discourse as apolitical. Poverty is a result of famines, hurricanes, and tsunamis, and food is sent indiscriminately to feed the hungry wherever they are. For human rights activists, poverty is not a question of political or social or economic justice, but simply a natural claim of humanitarian justice. In short, human rights serves as a foothold for those who do not wish to be aligned with theoretical intricacies or dogmas, and who have tired of the abundance of ideologies, none of which have brought mankind simple human happiness. That's a quote from Andrei Sakharov, the Russian dissident. As other utopian visions failed to bring equality, communism, true freedom, and world peace, human rights promised a minimalist, hardy utopia that could survive in the harsh climate of globalization and the victory of a global capitalist system. Arendt seeks her bearings in thinking about human rights from her experience of the Jews and minority peoples during and preceding the Holocaust. The true, quote, calamity of the rightless, she writes, in the middle of the 20th century, isn't, and this is important for understanding her work in general and often overlooked. The true calamity of the rightless is not that they are deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or of equality before the law and freedom of opinion, but that they no longer belong to any community whatsoever. I hope you recognize how extreme the provocation Arendt here offers truly is. Life is not a human right. On the contrary, all humans will die. The only question is how they will die. She did not advocate a Jewish army so that Jews could expel the Arabs from Israel, as Peter Berkson and Vladimir Jabinsky did. She called them Zionist fascists. Arendt sought a Jewish army to replace death by extermination with the more dignified death by fighting. It is a mistake Arendt helps us to see, to think that our humanitarian assistance to Syrian fighters today serves the humanity of those fighters. They are, in her thinking, more human when fighting and dying for a cause than when they are living safely in a Red Crescent camp. In other words, human rights often better serve the interests of human rights activists than the purported beneficiaries. This itself was the opinion of Peter Benison, the founder of Amnesty International. Benison explicitly imagined Amnesty as a nonpartisan organization, quote, a common base upon which the idealists of the world can cooperate. As Benison writes, quote, it matters more to harness the enthusiasm of the helpers. The real martyrs prefer to suffer, and as I would add, this is Benison still, the real saints are no worse off in prison than anywhere on this earth. At least in some instances, the true beneficiaries of human rights are those idealists who comprise what Joseph Slaughter has called Human Rights, Inc., a web of organizations whose very existence depends upon the continuation of human rights abuses around the world. In Arendt's words, the final paradox of human rights is that human rights, both their existence and their loss, quote, coincides with the instant when a person becomes a human being in general, without profession, without a citizenship, without an opinion, without a deed by which to identify and specify himself. Human rights, in other words, imagines and thus paves the way for the emergence of men so deprived of what makes them human that they are nothing more than barbarians and savages. No human being has a right to live or live comfortably. Human beings, Arendt writes, can lose all so-called rights of man without losing their essential quality as human beings, their human dignity. Only the loss of a polity, of a community, expels man from humanity. It is this total deprivation of rights through the exclusion from an organized community that makes manifest the one truly human right, what Arendt calls the right to have rights. This very controversial account of human rights has put Arendt very much at the center of attempts to understand human rights in modern discourse. And among her many, many critics, one stands out, and that's Jacques Rancière. For Rancière accuses Arendt, who is often thought of as the great thinker of political action, of depolitizing politics. Rancière argues that Arendt's critique of the abstractness and inhumanity of human rights was actually a critique of democracy. Democracy, Rancière writes, is most fundamentally a paradoxical politics. The democratic paradox is that democracy, understood as freedom and the rule by people, always threatens to destabilize and revolutionize democratic government that offers itself as a legitimate order. True democratic politics is on the side of the messy, individualist, and disruptive aspect of democracy. Rancière's word for this is dissensus, and he argues that democracy implies a practice of dissensus, one that it keeps reopening, and that the practice of ruling relentlessly plugs. Democracy, in other words, is the practice of disrupting all statist orders, even democratic state orders. It is, quote, an anarchic principle, and, quote, insofar as it is anarchic, it precludes the self-grounding of politics. Politics, democratic politics, modern politics, is unavoidably open and anarchic. Now, despite their differences, Rancière and Arendt both are engaged in the project of articulating and activating a public-spirited political engagement in a global world hostile to politics. They share that. They both distinguish politics from philosophy, since philosophy trades in truths that shut down politics, which is about opinions, or doxa. Rancière, as does Arendt, defines politics as a form of action, an action of the people, in the plural, and not of states. Further, as I have mentioned, Arendt, like Rancière, also thinks democracy is a revolutionary expression of freedom. Because politics is so deeply connected to revolutionary action, Arendt actually refuses to call it democracy. Because democracy is like all crasis, derived from the Greek kratein, expressing rule. Democracy as majority rule opposes revolutionary action and is, in Arendt's words, simply another form of rulership. As does Rancière, Arendt insists that freedom demands that we move beyond democracy as simply a form of government. In spite of these apparent similarities, Rancière builds his theory of dissensus in opposition to Arendt's work. In Does Democracy Mean Something?, Rancière makes clear his view that democracy cannot consist in a set of institutions. That's a quote. Institutions, he argues, mean nothing in themselves. Quote, "The reason for this is that one and the same constitution and set of laws can be implemented in opposite ways depending on the sense of the common in which they are framed." Now, Rancière's point here is obvious, I think. At times, the Constitution and the laws are invoked to stifle debate and dissent. At other times, they are called upon to enable and further the call for new political institutions. In themselves, the Constitution and the laws are not decisive. But Rancière goes further. Not only are political institutions not decisive in politics, they unjustly occupy the field of politics with a claim to legitimacy and thus delimit and shrink the political stage. By establishing what is constitutional and legal, by deciding what a peaceful protest is and who can protest, and by policing the question of who is even a citizen, the institutions of politics limit politics in a biased way, he writes. They police the boundaries and access to politics in the name of the purity of the political. Political institutions are, for Rancière, anti-political in the ways that they establish and thus regulate politics. Now, in his suspicion of institutions, Rancière does indeed, in important ways, depart from Arendt. For Arendt, modern politics as revolutionary politics means a new founding of freedom. What distinguishes revolutions from rebellions is that while rebellions merely liberate one from rule, revolutions found new institutions that nurture freedom. At the core of Arendt's political thinking is her insistence that freedom cannot exist outside of institutions. As had Montesquieu before her, Arendt saw that power, freedom, and collective action belong together. The genius of the American Revolution in Arendt's telling is that it discovered what she calls a new experience of power. This American experience of power was embodied in all institutions of self-government throughout the country. It goes back to the Mayflower Compact drawn up on the ship and signed by the first settlers upon landing, an act that displays their obvious confidence that they had the power on their own, granted and confirmed by no one, and as yet unsupported by any means of violence, to combine themselves together into a civil body politic. From out of the basic experience of power through mutual action with others, the American colonists developed their institutions of town halls, constitutional conventions, and local government in townships, counties, and states. What the new experience of American power meant was that there could not be, and could never be in the United States, a single highest and irresistible power that could exert its rule over others. The states would limit the federal government. The federal government would contest state power. Legislative power limits executive power. Judicial power bridles the legislature. And new forms of power, involuntary organizations, political clubs, advocacy groups, all limit the power of professional politicians. Since written laws cannot control power, but only power arrests power, in Arendt's phrase, freedom depends upon institutions that can continually give birth to new centers and sources of power. Together, this diffusion of power in the United States meant the, quote, consistent abolition of sovereignty within the body politic of the republic. The reason Arendt finds constitutional republics to be the most human form of government is not simply because constitutions establish inviolable civil and human rights that democratic majorities cannot breach. For Arendt, part of what it means to be human is to act in public. Constitutions refer not simply to written documents, but to the act of constituting a people. Constitutions, therefore, entail the power to act, since power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. There is for Arendt a human right not simply to act and speak as an individual, but also to be part of a group in which one can, as an individual, act in concert with others towards the public good. What Arendt saw following Montesquieu is that human life entails the capacity to act in concert, as opposed to the human rights idea that all men possessed rights by virtue of being born human, or the anarchist idea that human rights precluded living under government. Arendt insists upon the necessity of civilized government for all mankind, something obviously that is opposed by anarchists. What distinguished the American Constitutional Republic, the American Constitutional Republic form of government in Arendt's telling, was its declaration that all men, as human beings, should live under constitutional, limited government. Against Rancière, for whom institutions are biased watchmen, patrolling the entry into politics, Arendt sees the institutions of self-government as the common world within which citizens congregate, talk, and act. Without such institutions, there would be no public space, no commons. Politics needs not only revolution and dissensus, but also some prior consensus, an acknowledgement of the facts of the political world we are born into. From there one can, and sometimes must, resist and revolt. If Rancière sees all consensus, all that is common, as exclusionary, violent, and apolitical, Arendt insists that politics must aim to strive to inaugurate a plural consensus and thus plural powers and plural freedoms. One such example is citizenship. That is why Rancière opposes Arendt's argument that the only truly human right, what she calls the right to have rights, guarantees to human beings the right to belong to an organized community. In other words, Arendt insists that humanity requires a consensus, some form of political organization in which one can speak and be judged by others. So let me conclude by saying that I see the debate between Rancière and Arendt, and also the debate between Arendt and Grabers, as in-house debates, largely debates amongst people who agree on far more than they disagree. Indeed, these debates mark the place where we are in today's globalized world. Globalization is here to stay. And yet to say it is unavoidable must not mean that it is our fate. There must be, and there are, human responses to globalization. Responses that can reimagine politics in a global world, and therefore humanize the world that is often oppressive, distant, and dehumanizing. But if we are to resist globalization, we need first to understand it. The challenge of globalization, speaking politically, is its size and impersonality. Its newness is that it radicalizes the already existing trend toward anonymity, powerlessness, and the bureaucratic rule of nobody in modern society. We live in a world where political power has become so gigantic, convoluted, brutal, and mechanical that human beings have lost the confidence in their ability to act together with others to control, make, and share a common world. The global order does not allow for individual political agency, or at least it allows for political action only in the most innocuous ways. Anarchism is one form of political action in the global world, but anarchism also fits comfortably with globalization. It refuses the first requirement of politics, the foundation of a polity or a people, and seeks instead to form a global community of rebels. In place of the foundation of common polity, global anarchism offers rebelliousness and radical gestures of resistance to a globalized system. While such actions of rebellion offer moments of freedom, those moments do not congeal into institutions that foster the human need of politics, to overcome our frail and mortal individual selves and create institutions and collectivities that outlive us and remake our common world. Human rights also is a way of acting politically in a globalized world that works comfortably within globalization. Seeking to protect minimal requirements of human dignity, human rights satisfies itself with smoothing out what are perceived to be the roughest edges of the global political and economic order. The international movement for human rights thus legitimates globalization as it abandons politics and the effort to build just and meaningful political institutions. In place of politics that might actually change the world or offer human beings deep and abiding lives in common with others, human rights simply articulates a minimum condition of life, one that is not attentive to the political humanity of human being. The great tension of our times is that between a humanism that builds a world and the instinct to rebel. Idealistic movements like anarchism and human rights embrace rebellion and dissensus, seeking liberation amidst spaces of freedom. What they forget, however, is that freedom is not the same as liberation. Human freedom is political freedom, and politics can only grow and prosper in a humanly built world. In an age aware of the way every human creation limits and suspends others, we are suspicious of all human politics. But to truly resist the dehumanizing thrust of globalization, we need to constitute spaces of freedom in which we can live together according to public ideals like justice, not simply temporary spaces in which we can rebel. We must, in other words, risk consensus and build new and vibrant local, political, and constitutional orders. Thank
you. Well, as is unknown, Roger will be expected to take questions. Yeah, let me start. This question, just in a sense, is an expression of my kind of abiding discomfort with Arendt. Because there seems to be in Arendt one impulse, which is freedom involves acting together in public. If that's a kind of minimal definition of freedom, then it seems to me, all sorts of non-political institutions, cultures are spaces of freedom. The one that comes to my mind is, let's say, religion. It's public, it involves acting together, it has a shared purpose, etc. It often involves articulating needs for change, and big issues. But there's also in Arendt this other talk about being memorialized. You also always want to leave something behind. She's very impressed with memory, and people will remember me after I die as Achilles or some other big honcho. And, one might say, look, what the hell has that got to do with politics? Why does one need that element in politics? What kind of debasement of my humanity is there if I say, I don't care if I'm remembered? Arendt's answer is, well, in some sense, then you were not political. And what troubles me here is, look, I mean, there are a bunch of people out there, they're, let's say, religious or artistic or something, and they're acting together, they're doing things. But these people never get dignified in Arendt. There's something deficient about it. And yes, I'm just not, and you're taking that deficiency and then projecting it onto Occupy Wall Street, global protests for human rights, women who are protesting in downtown Manhattan so that women in Afghanistan have better rights. All that gets deflated. So you see the force of my question. Why should one not view these movements as being fully human, not in any deficient way?
Yeah, it's an excellent and big question. I said at the very end of my talk, I said the great tension of our times is between a humanism that builds a world and an instinct to rebel. The instinct to rebel, it comes in many forms, but it's what I have in mind when I say such a thing is something like the Grand Inquisitor Ivan in the Brothers. It's this claim that we don't want the responsibility of being human, and so we say, look, we're just private people. We're just like it's the return to the animal in a certain way that's going on in theory and other things today, and so what you're, I think, hitting upon is deeply right. Arendt has a humanist view of the world, and she makes a very strong claim that to be human, it's not that you must be rational, that was Kant, and it's not that you must, it's not even that you must be political per se, although that's part of it. There are three parts: action, work, and labor. You need all three. But what she really says is that that there are two things that human beings are. On the one hand, they are earthly. What that means, they're created, and they're fated, and they're subject to fate. And on the other hand, they build a world. And in building a world, they can, in a sense, build the world in which they then live and change fate and change the human condition. The human condition is actually changeable. She thinks that to not build a world, right, is to live not like humans. To not care about and not pursue that agenda of actually changing the world, of creating it. In a sense, taking up our human burden of not just living, but living justly.
Hello, may I have your attention? May I have your attention?
Back on the subway.
This is the Emergency Action Plan Director. We received an alarm Municipal Station Law we're currently investigating. Please stand by for further information. Thank you.
So the fire alarm? Well, you know, along the way, there's a button you can push oftentimes.
Sorry, Roger.
It's okay. We'll stand by. But in any case, so yes, she does make the claim.
May I have your attention? May I have your attention? We received the emergency police station law on the Astaire case. We're currently investigating. Please stand by for further information. Thank you.
How often is this going to go on?
And where did it take place?
Well, if it's going to go every 20 seconds, we'll have to stop where.
In any case,
keep going.
To answer your question today, the idea that what do you care? What does one care if they're not remembered? She would say that if you don't care, you're not human. And we can say, well, that sounds crazy. And there's different ways to be remembered, by the way. There's being remembered by your family. There's being remembered. So she doesn't think that you have to, be a political actor to be human. And she doesn't think that if you're not remembered, that if you don't care if you're remembered, then you're not political. Yeah, it might be that you're not political, but for her, you don't have to be political at all times, but you have to want to be remembered. And she thinks human beings, as human beings, need to be remembered, which is one of the reasons we demand justice, so that if we have injustice done to us, people have to be remembered.
What I would like you to focus maybe on is, why not religion? It seems to meet all the kind of important criteria.
Yeah.
It's done in public, it's done with others, it involves something larger than yourself, it doesn't have to be narcissistic, it doesn't have to be privately,
the difference, that there's one major difference between religion and politics, right? And in a lot of ways, you're right. But in politics, everybody confronts each other as an equal. And in religion, there's a hierarchy.
I guess I just find that to be such a kind of, first of all, I find it to be a claim that requires so many qualifications. The first part, that we are all equal in politics.
There's also no absolute in politics. In religion, we all accept. It depends on the religion, and we have to talk about what religion we're talking about. But most religions, we submit ourselves to some absolute authority. That's the very antithesis of what politics is for her. There's no authority that we submit ourselves to.
Yeah. And I just find, I guess this is more a disagreement with Arendt. I just find, look, if one says that in religion one submits oneself to an absolute authority, at an everyday level, it seems to me that claim is no more or no less true than the claim that at an everyday level we submit politically.
Well, to the extent that second claim is true, we are, in her words, not acting politically, whereas in the first claim we would be acting religiously. The essence of political action for her is to refuse all rule.
Well, I guess...
May I have your attention? May I have your attention? We have investigated the source of the alarm and it's been proven to be a false alarm. Please go about your daily business. Thank you.
Well, our daily business is to have questions.
System is working. Susan?
So I think you argue well from the text. I think that what you say, Arendt says,
May I have your attention? May I have your attention?
I'll just let you stop there.
The Action Plan Director, we have investigated the source of the alarm and it's been proven to be a false alarm. Please go about your normal business.
How can we go about our normal business, man?
I'm sorry. Okay, so you know, I kind of get that, and you know, and obviously, you know, Rossier does criticize Arendt, and you are putting Rossier kind of in the anarchism bunch. Graeber, I think, is a difficult figure because he's pretty fringe to anything that's really going on, as far as I can tell. But I guess my question would be, if we're dealing with globalization, and globalization is something new, and incidentally, the sub-question is, why do you suppose it was 1977 that this happened? That's, you know. But if we're dealing with globalization, and globalization is something new, how is it that Heidegger and Arendt, etc., can be adequate theorists for understanding the situation? Or we're not in anything new. And when you bring up the Arab Spring, or what happened in Israel, you could mention Moscow, or Greece, or Spain, etc., 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 etc. Isn't there something new there that isn't simply people abstractly connecting by cell phones as if they had a community, but they really don't? So the question is, if time is going to play a role in your presentation, why doesn't it play a role in your
So that's nice. So there's a couple. Let me first answer the sort of last question, or the two sub-questions, I guess, which is what I took to be the, well, isn't there more than just abstraction on the ground in Tel Aviv and Zuccotti Park question? And the answer to that is yes. I mean, I think the excitement and the interest that those two movements generated was precisely what David Graeber, and he may be a fringe figure or not. I mean, it's amazing how quickly he became part of the mainstream between October and December of last year. You know, I've actually found his books quite, you know, the Debt book and the Direct Action book quite interesting. I could be wrong, and I'm happy to have people who know more about the topic tell me I'm wrong. But so I think that for both Graeber and Arendt agree that there is something thrilling about simply being together with other people and talking. And I think that that part of Occupy Wall Street was exceptional to me. Where they then part company is that Arendt thinks it's important and thrilling, and it can actually be leading to freedom to do that, but at some point the freedom has to try to establish things. So, you know, the way I had conceived it was amazing, great, but it has to move from a park to town boards, from a park to institutions. And I thought the unwillingness of the movement to move, to make that move, was precisely its unwillingness to engage in the kind of consensus. They wanted it, there was a desire for consensus, but without actually risking establishing a consensus. And that was, to me, the weakness of those movements, despite the fact that I found them incredibly important and hopeful. As for 1977, you know, why 1 year? I mean, Samuel Moyn counted the number of times it was mentioned. The easiest answer is it was the year Amnesty International was founded. It's not an accident in my account that Amnesty International is the first great human rights organization. It's completely nonpartisan. It's completely, it seeks no lasting political changes. It simply seeks to free dissidents and individuals. And It was actually focused mostly on the Soviet Union at that time, so it had a political tint to it as well. But I think that's the answer to the sub-questions, if I understood it. To the bigger question, the main question of is there something new in globalization? You know, I don't know what you're supposed to say at a committee on globalization, but I mean, I think it's fairly clear that my answer was somewhat no. I mean, I said it in the paper that I think globalization is a radicalization of things like imperialism, which is about overcoming borders and pan-national movements in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I think from a political point of view, it is and globalization largely works on the calculus of economics. Economics believes that there are no limits to growth, that growth is infinite. The calculus of politics for 2,000 or more years has always been that there are limits. There are borders, so there are physical limits, but there's also ethical limits. There's things we shouldn't do. And we as a political community have to decide what we can and can't do. But economics is the science of no limits, that growth should be eternal. And imperialism, as I understand imperialism, was the importation of economic logic into politics. I think globalization is a radicalization of that imperialist, unlimited economic approach to politics. I also think that it fits with the rise of bureaucracies at the same time, because bureaucracies, in a sense, well, not in a sense, what bureaucracies do is diffuse responsibility and thus allow for no limits on the extension of political power. So I think globalization is new in the speed and in the intensity at which it's happening, and as Graeber said, in the way that free market ideology has suddenly become itself a human rights issue, so that we think of free markets and any limitation on the free markets as a restriction on human rights. But go ahead.
I want to push you on this a little bit, because Tahrir Square is also part of globalization.
Tahrir Square?
Yeah, it didn't just happen in Tel Aviv and
Yep.
Occupy Wall Street. And Tahrir Square was covered live by Al Jazeera, English, and I'm sure Arabic too, 24 hours a day. And one could watch that non-Western mass media live revolution.
Yeah.
And for me, that was new. I mean, having lived through a lot of what you were talking about, you know, giving money to Amnesty International, etc., for me, that was new.
Yes.
That experience of learning from Egyptian democratic grassroots organizing with quite spontaneous, I mean, they were not anarchists,
Oh, yeah.
but they certainly were spontaneously organizing, protecting cops, protecting each other, feeding each other, cleaning up, etc. I was enormously impressed by that, and I don't hear that, my experience of that, in your presentation. I don't see any place for it.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you think that that was important, or if that just really is not part of the picture, not necessarily part of the picture of the analysis.
It's a fair and good question. I don't know yet. I watched it to a certain degree, but I wasn't one of the people glued to a TV or a Twitter feed. I certainly found it to be thrilling, and I happen to agree with you in your description of the respect that I had for the activists. I mean, I just read Wael Gonim's Revolution 2.0, actually in German, when I was over there in the train station one day. It's an amazing account, and I find him to be an enormously thoughtful and sympathetic figure. I also feel that way about a lot of people who were in Zakai Park and other places. I, for one, am in awe of the people right now in Homs and in Syria, much more so even than people anywhere else, because these people are basically know that they might vary. I mean, you know, they're going to, a lot of them are going to be killed, and they're like, they care, yes, but they're willing to fight for it. That to me is incredibly inspirational. But you know, and this comes to but you know, so you say. But I mean, we've had revolutions for a long time, and we've had people who resisted for a long time. And I take, if I understand the force of your question, and I'm trying to take it as serious as I can. What does it mean that we can watch it live? What does it mean?
It's not that we can watch it live. It's that Al Jazeera, which is a Kuwaiti,
yeah.
firm, and a lot of young reporters, and this was now the Arab report, which would have been even more innovative, perhaps. I mean, I didn't have to get it filtered through CNN domestic.
Yeah, you didn't, but most people did. But you didn't have to.
You could go online and get it. And
yeah, you could, but I'm saying most people wouldn't or didn't.
Right, because they were in the community that you like so much. They were.
Oh, well.
No, I know you don't. I'm teasing in a way,
Yeah.
but in a certain way, for me, that was a real breakout. It was a real breakout, and something new happened for me, politically at that point, which I don't find adequately grasped by Western political theory to date.
Mm-hmm. It may well be. I mean, you know, we've had communications from fronts and from revolutions through letters, through telegraphs, through, you know, eyewitness accounts for a long time, and I think it's somewhat disingenuous to say, oh, it's just the same thing but with a different technology. I think your claim, is that you get an unmediated version of the events. I don't think that's right.
My point is not just a technological difference. I'm not talking about it simply as a technological revolution.
So we can hear the Arab voice or the local voice?
I guess part of it was that it just kind of like blew a hole in imperialism. It wasn't about the United States brokering something. It wasn't about the United States bringing democracy. It wasn't about the United States or the West at all.
Mm-hmm.
And there was something in the fact that people were taking their lead from third world country of people not ready for democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that I found, at least in my own perception, my own political experience of it, very liberating.
Mm-hmm. That I agree with. I think, you know, I mean, one of the big differences between a place like Tahrir Square and Libya, right, was that in Libya, sort of the United States came in with NATO and sort of the white knight kind of aspect, whereas Tahrir Square really was a homegrown revolution. I mean, I certainly don't think that's the first time that's happened, so I don't think that's, but I mean, what we have is the technological ability through globalization to now, I mean, I guess what I hear you saying is we now have a situation in which we can actually, through globalization, witness sort of an anti-globalization or a rare non-globalized instance in a globalized world. And I guess that's true, and I'm not trying to be dismissive, certainly of Tahrir Square or of globalization. But I guess I don't think I think I can say I was deeply moved by Wael Ghonim book, and I was deeply moved by, and I am deeply moved by the people sacrificing their lives to fight for freedom in Syria. And I see these as anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolutions. And I find them I find, as with all revolutions that not all, but most that I witness, I'm moved by people's sacrifices and desire to live freely. I guess I'm not sure what that has to do with the technological aspects of globalization. Yeah, I can see it happening. Someone can hold their camera up, but I mean, seeing it happening in the end, you know, there are so many different ways that those things can be partial and deceived. I'm not so convinced that we're experiencing something new there. I mean, I think it's thrilling, but I'm not sure I get the newness. I mean, obviously there's new things, but I don't see the real difference, and maybe I'm just being deaf to that, and I apologize. Yeah? Oh, you want to call?
I'd kind of like to pick up where Mr. McMorris left off, and I think that I'm hearing your question a different way, being in this course with you right now. Namely that one of the things that we've been talking about quite a bit is the way in which not so much the technology, but the directionality of the influences is something that's fundamentally new in the types of causality or social conjuncture, if you will, that these revolutions are coming out of. That we have at the inception of Occupy Wall Street, political activists like we've experienced in Argentina, in Egypt, in Spain, coming and teaching Western so-called activists how to protest, or giving political form and providing ideas about the institutions that the political form will take, I think is something that's really new. So actually I have two questions. The first one kind of goes back to some of the debates that we've had about Heidegger.
Well, can I just first ask a question about that first question? Sure. I mean, some of the most important lessons about resistance in the world that before globalization have been taught by people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King. How different, you say directionality, but how different is it to learn from Gandhi than it is to learn from someone from Argentina? I mean, maybe I'm missing the question.
Well, right, so we can talk about the whole post-war period as a period wherein this thing is changing, so we can add Gandhi and Martin Luther King to a narrative whereby the directionality of that politics is shifting. But actually, I don't necessarily want to focus too much on that. Or can I attach it to the second part of my question?
Okay, yeah, no, I just was trying to understand where this change happens. Or
the second, so the two questions are as follows. The first one is that you, in terms of the question about globalization, this is also building on some things Mr. Morris said. How can Arendt and Heidegger really be useful as our primary theorists of globalization? You talked at the beginning of your paper about how Heidegger talks about how all remoteness in time and space contract. And I'm wondering about your decision to use Heidegger there as opposed to a theorist of capitalism, such as David Harvey or Neil Smith, who talk about a very uneven type of development of the contraction of space and time. And I think that this brings me to a question about how what I see happening in this type of a narrative is you end up with two scales, the global and the highly local, with less of a differentiated understanding of the different scales at which social reality, power, and capital actually function in terms of their subordination of the individual. And my critique of Occupy Wall Street has been not so much that it has a lack of institutions, because I think actually anyone who's been involved in the movement see that there are there's tremendous concern with precisely the questions that you asked about institutions, about consensus, about being concerned about building a prefigurative politics. And I think that Graeber is highly interested in those things, and his ethnographic account of the way in which people do this was supposed to be a tool for political action, political activism. I think that's why his ethnographic work and the work by Marina Citrin also has been really instructive for activists to give us examples of how institutions can function in these types of political settings. So I think that the second question to you was, how would you respond to that? I think that in a lot of ways, the image you give of Graeber is a bit unfair. And I think that he's actually, and a lot of activists in Occupy Wall Street are doing something much more akin to what Hannah Arendt would like to see. And perhaps the definition of institution that we're working with is a little bit too narrow.
Okay. So there's a couple things. One is, I tried to say I think they're part of a similar, right? And I think there's a lot of similarities. I haven't tried to sit here and say David Graeber's awful, right? I'm engaging him because I think he's interesting. I'm reading his text, and that may be an unfair way to actually approach his work, and I'm happy to be told that. That's what I had available to me. His text is very clearly, he says what he says. Rancière is very clearly opposed to institutions. I think you're right. There's a very close similarity between Rancière and Arendt and Graeber and Arendt. And I could sit here and say, they're all saying the same thing, and I wouldn't be that far off. I'm actually trying to make a distinction. I'm trying to make a distinction because I think there's a small difference that matters. And I think the part of the paper that I ended with near the end, where I said we have to risk consensus, is I think something that a lot of people don't agree with, that I think is important. We have to be willing to set up ideals of justice. We have to be willing to tell people you're wrong. And the whole human rights world is an unwillingness to, because we're unwilling to make these kind of political distinctions, we retreat to a lowest common denominator where it's almost impossible to disagree. And I'm trying to say that we actually have to make these kind of distinctions. I'm going to answer your other question by saying something I know I should say, which is, you said, well, why do I, read globalization through Arendt and Heidegger and not through more modern or more Marxist? And let me say, globalization for me is a word of jargon. So is imperialism, so is Marxism. These are jargonistic words. We can sit here, when I started, I don't write on globalization as a practice. When I was asked to give this talk, I went and tried to find definition. I had a whole computer file of definitions of globalization. I have no idea what it means, right? And so to a certain extent, I think anyone who starts talking about globalization has to, there's a certain kind of fiat, here I am. Why do I choose Arendt and Heidegger? Because I'm not interested in globalization. I'm interested in the problem of humanity in our time, right? And globalization is one way in which we can, through a word of jargon that's currently, interesting, begin to think about the problem of humanity in our time. Why did I choose Arendt and Heidegger? I didn't only choose them. I talked about Montesquieu, I talked about Rancière, I talked about Graeber. I talk about people whose work I read and find interesting. Why do I find it interesting? Not because I'm a Arendtian. I founded the Arendt Center 5 years ago. It was an accident that I founded it. I hadn't written or taught Arendt in 15 years. Suddenly I have to read Arendt. I found, reading her, that I find her very compelling. Arendt and Heidegger are two people who, when I'm alone, I find make me think. They speak to me in a way that sounds true. So when I quote Heidegger about the remote distanceless of the world, it makes sense to me now. That it made sense 50 years ago, means that we've changed since then, but maybe not as much as, we all want to think that at every moment we're at is a special moment, right? It's actually a need of humanity to think that at every moment there's something new happening, and we always create new words and new ideas to name those. But it's rare that we enter a truly new age. And I think it's fine to talk about globalization. I think it's an important idea. I'm open to being told what it really is. But I'm not yet smart enough to know that. I'm still trying. And I mean that in the most open sense I can say. I have read some of these globalization theorists. I find them interesting, but I haven't yet. I still find the vocabulary of Arendt and Heidegger, and not just them, but I find that compelling.
I think it's interesting to start. I have no problem with you starting with Arendt.
Some people have class.
Oh.
I think there's the changing of the class guard.
To think about this moment and these issues. I mean, I think it's really interesting, especially her thoughts about politics and challenging. Because so speaking to this question of what's new or what might have changed. So one story that we often hear in people talking about globalization seems to be, you know, in its general outlines, persuasive to me, is that there was a moment when national states had a different kind of ability to shape, if not totally control, national economies. And that citizens could make claims on national states with respect to questions about distribution or justice or equity or regulation. And that calculus has completely changed.
Yeah, when did it change?
Well, it has changed, you know, whether we argue about 1973 or 1966
Well, how
or
about 1890? I mean, the imperialist age.
No, I'm talking about the kind of the unraveling of the Fordist Compromise, the unraveling of the post-war. You know, so I would say it changed with the end of growth, right? So I'm not asking you to answer that, but I'm saying that something has changed such that, so I'm also extremely attracted to, I mean, I agree with Zoltan that personally, I think it's productive to think about resonances among people seemingly as different as the horizontalist conversation and the Arendtian conversation and someone like Rancière. But I appreciate your point about small differences often matter, and when they seem to matter, part of what we can do is put them on the table and amplify them and ramify them. So I think that's great. But so I'm really attracted to a lot, unlike Uday, and we've had this conversation many times before, I am attracted to some of these Arendtian propositions about building a world in common, about founding a polity, about, you know, the Supreme Court as a permanent constitutional convention or always being in session. And I like your formulation about risking consensus. But the question for me is not to kind of go after someone like, you know, anarchists for not risking consensus, but to think about how any of those propositions could be realized, how they could make sense in this moment. In a moment when global governance is taking place at a very different scale through regulation, through private international law, through all these other kinds of agencies and orders, global governance is taking place in a way that completely short circuits or cuts across that Arendtian vision. In a world where statelessness is, again, exploding in unimaginable ways, in enormous ways. In a moment when the prospect for people acting in concert in order to deliberate about, you know, to deliberate and make judgments about what needs to be done so that we can live a more just life, can't work in the same way by making claims on states, for example. So I'm not, you know, this is not an anti-statist position at all. But so I am really starting with you at your starting point and say, how on earth does, like your concluding sentence, which was about new local viable constitutional political orders, kind of comport with this new reality? I actually am, so to me, I think you're starting with a really important question, like, how do Arendt's insights about politics and democracy speak to us now? But I don't think it's self-evident. I don't think going back to Arendt's argument about constitutional communities make any sense, but her provocation about what does it mean to build a common world And what does it mean to be part of a polity when how we can think about polity has to be totally different at this moment?
I agree. So what are the positive steps one can take, right? I mean, if that's the question, to build such worlds. I could sit here and say, oh, the first thing is we have to understand the need for it, and there's a truth to that. But, yes, we need, I was talking with one of your colleagues, I don't know his last name, Michael?
Yeah,
Mike
lunch,
yeah. And he was talking about this participatory budgeting work that he's doing, which came out of this seminar we had this afternoon, and that strikes me as very interesting. I spent 2 years working with constitutional court judges in South Africa, and really being just unbelievably impressed with the way they were going about building a constitutional culture over there. And what was impressive about it was that they did not want their constitution to be like a supra-legislative set of rules. They wanted it to be based in dignity and Ubuntu and this idea of a living communal order. And then they have first of all, their constitutional court building is open and everyone goes and gets tours, and they have this table which is built out of one piece of wood that people sit around and debate. And to me, it was actually an illustration of what Arendt meant about the Supreme Court as in a sense, being an exemplification of the kind of thinking and debating that about who we are as a people that needs to go on. So I actually don't think we can just give up on our constitutional culture in this country. I think our current constitutional culture is bankrupt and has become so obsessed with interpreting rules that that any judge who actually will make a judgment is considered to be anathema on either the left or the right. And I think that has to change. How is that going to change? It's not going to change until we bring back into fashion political judgment. We bring back into fashion the idea that we would rather have people make judgments, sometimes good, sometimes bad. How do we do that? Well, I think you've got to empower local people to make changes and stop and disempower bureaucracies to a large extent. So all of that's fine. How do you do it? I don't have the answer.
No, I totally agree with that, but I guess and something we're all struggling with is that example in South Africa, which sounds very Arendtian in the best sense of that word, may not matter. Like in this moment, that kind of deliberation may have, like deliberation about who we want to be as a people, it may be impossible to translate that into the kind of world-making and polity-building actions that Arendt also cared about. So my question is, in a world where, in a neoliberal, globalized world, where the forces that are constraining people's ability to realize themselves as fully human are operating at a different level or a different scale, how do we, and it's not just a question of scaling up, but I mean, to me, that's the Arendtian question, is how do you take what's happening around that table in South Africa and make it meaningful at this moment in exactly, and I'm not saying, Roger, give me the policy talking points, but to me, like, that's the question that Arendt...
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what I think we need to do. I mean, no one's going to do it. I think you need to have a new constitutional convention. I think you need to risk a revolution in this country. I think you need to say, look, the country's broken.
But Gary's point is not about in this country.
Well, okay, I think in every country it's different. I mean, I think South Africa actually currently has a constitutional culture and has a sense of who they are as a country.
But their ability to build a just society is constrained by forces that are beyond the South African
Well,
state.
I don't think that's true. I mean,
And
you're
this is-
using justice in a different way than I am. I think you're building a society in which people are engaged in the question of justice. Are they all equal? No. But I don't think justice requires that everybody be equal. I think people are different, and obviously I wish everyone had a house and food. But I think South Africa, look, not 100%, but to an extraordinary degree right now, is a country that really does have a sense of itself. That's from my experience with it. I haven't been there in 3 years at this point, so maybe I'm wrong at this, now. But I know this country the best, and I've lived in a bunch of countries, but this is the one I know the best. I mean, the problem here is that I don't want to say there's no hope, because I always think there is hope, and I think there's possibility that things will change, but it's a very depressing place to live, from a political point of view, in my view. We need some people who are willing to, say, look, maybe we need to form a bunch of little countries, or maybe we need to try something else. But that's destabilizing, and that's risky, and people are risk averse. But that's what I think would be the answer. I don't know.
Do you not, I mean, I guess because what you just ended with, there's a million things, like a ton of notes and there's a whole bunch of stuff. But just on that last little bit, to me, what you ended with, and like what it could be in possibility in constitutional convention, that's actually what's happening around the world. My world that I'm living in, with the thousands of assemblies that are taking place in the United States, and villages and towns and cities, I mean, that is people creating democracy together, a real democracy, creating the infrastructure that's everything from, yes, food and simple things, not simple, but to alternative adjudication processes that we've been coming up with that go beyond mediation, that are like circle justice. And so, and this is all around the US and Spain and Greece, where I've been also more recently. So like all of those processes I actually see as what you're talking about, but I see them happening now. So that's just one kind of thing I wanted to grab onto. I think it's important to separate the conversation around governance and state. Most languages do that. In English, we don't, and I think it's a problem because, all of the anarchists I've read just talk about some form of governance. And that is different than state structure, and so what all of the different movements now are talking, there's a whole lot of structure and concepts of governance. Yeah. And talking about decentralized governance and federated governance and all kinds of things. So just kind of as a clarify. And then maybe this isn't important really, but I think, no, it is, because what is anarchism and what is non-hierarchy, or looking at power in a different way, are different things, and I think it's really important. So, for example, the Zapatistas are, actually, some of the initial, the kind of inside, there's a whole long history of where the Zapatistas come from as a movement and a force, but anarchist is not actually the origin. Some of the individuals who went into Chiapas have more of a Maoist and a Marxist background, and then initially the Zapatistas wanted to take over the state. It lasted all of a few days, and people didn't mobilize to do it, and so then they took over hundreds of thousands of hectares in Chiapas, and hundreds of thousands of people live with what they call the juntas de buen gobierno, the good governance, good government, and they have a whole government structure, judicial structure, and everything else, and because they don't have hierarchy and they're thinking about power in different ways, it can look like anarchism. I think it's important that it's not. They say that they're not. I think if you were to ask most people, they'd be like, oh, what? I found that in Argentina as well, with, saying, oh, what is something like that? That looks like anarchism. And people were like, looks like what? It's not. So I think it's to be really careful about that, because the kind of isms of the project of anarchism for a lot of different people means a lot of different things. And because movements have non-hierarchy doesn't necessarily make them anarchists, and it's the same thing for the global movements now, I think. But there might be individuals who are involved who are anarchists. Yeah. But there's a big difference with that. And on the other. So I think I had a whole bunch of different movements.
Yeah, the first part of your question, that it's happening, right? That the revolution is going on.
Small bar.
Yeah. You know, there's, I guess, two answers. One is great. And the second is, I wish I saw it. And maybe I'm just in the wrong places. I mean, I lived in Berkeley for a number of years, and was part of the commune, and did that thing for a number of years. And I have a number of students who just 2 years ago left and went out and lived, are living, and they're part of this sort of communal movement in Berkeley, and we talk a lot about it. And I think, my view is I'm incredibly supportive of that as a way to live and a personal decision. I don't yet see it, and again, I don't know exactly which ones you mean, seeking and having an influence beyond a group of like-minded individuals who've chosen to live together.
Right. I wasn't actually, communes wouldn't be a point.
Okay,
I wouldn't use those as an example at all.
All right.
Sorry, maybe that's just, there's not really time to go through like, meeting.
Well, I mean, I know the work you've done in Argentina, right? And I think that's different. I think that's much more along the lines of what I have in mind than, I mean, what I think you do have to take over things, and I don't mean violently. You have to take over responsibility for feeding people, for housing people, for being the, you don't have to call it state, the governing structure. And that's sort of, in a certain sense, what the Muslim Brotherhood did for 30 or 40 years in Egypt. And they've won. Not the, unfortunately, Wael Ghanim in a certain way, but the Muslim Brotherhood, because they built the institutions. And there's something to be said for that. And I guess what I want to say is I'm deeply supportive of that. And I have no problem with the Muslim Brotherhood winning. I think we have to risk letting some groups that are liberal and some groups that are conservative and some that are religious and some that are atheist win. I'm much more open to that kind of a pluralist world of different orders. I mean, my first academic work was on legal pluralism, and that's really where I come out of. And I'm much more open to that than I am to global struggles. I'm much more open to those kind of attempts to build those local orders. And I'm sure it's happening. It doesn't, I haven't seen it come to New York City or Red Hook, where I live at the moment. I'm trying. And state versus government, I think I've talked about. As for what is anarchism, it's another word like globalization. I'm teaching a course on anarchism this year. I've assigned 13 or 14 different thinkers on anarchism, including the Weapons Are Our Words, and including your book, and including David Graeber, including Proudhon and Emma Goldman, and James Scott's book, Thinking Like a State. We're doing a lot, and every one of them thinks they're anarchism, and I'm not. My view is, I mean, in a certain sense, I'm trying to think about what's common to them. I'm, as with Heidegger and Arendt, I chose the books because they're books I want to read. They're thinkers who, to me, say something that's meaningful about the world. There's a search for freedom. I mean, to me, in the end, that's what anarchism is. That's why I'm attracted to anarchism, right? And so I'm interested in what is freedom. Anarchists, I think, are interested in what is freedom. And I think different anarchists have different things to teach me about what freedom is. What I liked about David Graeber's book, what I loved about it, was his framing of anarchism as a search for the spaces of freedom. I happen to think the way he framed it wasn't the way I want to frame it. And so I intervened in it. That's what I did. I'm not trying to claim that I made a talk about all anarchism. I was simply trying. I mean, the talk is not about anarchism, it's about freedom.
Yeah, no, that's why it was almost like a footnote, but I just had that, like, with David Graeber, like, great, and we can disagree and different, but for social movements that include hundreds of thousands of people that have a particular form or social relationship, that relationship is consistent with some people's interpretation of anarchism. I guess that's where I say, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't then make it.
Well, he calls the
anarchist.
Zapatistas anarchists.
I know. I disagree with him. Like, yeah.
I don't know enough, really, honestly, to say who's right. I mean, I'll say you're right because you're here.
Like Glenn Beck called David and I both socialists, and I was like, oh, okay, calling David a socialist I thought was actually kind of funny, but it was just because he starts out by saying, I'm an anarchist, and you're like, which part of that did you not hear? But just being really careful of the, like, okay.
Start listening to Glenn Beck as our source.
Yeah, somebody send me a link, whatever. I mean, it's not a really good point to make, but just that, you know, that it looks a certain way doesn't.
Yeah, but I mean, the question, you know, is what is anarchism? And again, I'm trying to answer that question because I find it an interesting question. To me, it's about freedom. What would you say it's about?
Yeah.
No? So if that's the case, the Zapatistas are one aspect of anarchism, whether they're pure anarchism or whether there is such a thing as pure anarchism. But I mean, once you say that, Arendt's an anarchist, and Thoreau's an anarchist.
So then you're with David on that, actually.
Well, I mean,
okay.
You know, I mean, Emma Goldman thought that the great anarchist was David Thoreau.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you have to sort of think about why not.
I think we have time for a last question. Candace?
Yeah, I have a different kind of question, although I think it picks up on some of this. I'm sitting here worrying about the human as it kind of emerged in this, and I'm wondering if I simply misunderstood your reading of Arendt, or whether this is actually accurate. Which is, I understood you to say that for Arendt, there's a certain kind of willful political activity, a willful political beingness that is a condition of being human. Is that right? Like one is fully human if one is fully...
She doesn't think that there's an essence to humanity.
But the activity of being
she does think that laboring, right? Now, and let me be a little more specific, right? Laboring, working, and acting are part of the human condition as humans have existed for about 2,000 some odd years, okay? The great or terrible, threatening thing about humans, Danon in the Sophoclean idea, the wondrous and horrifying thing about humans, is that we actually are a kind of being that can change the human condition. We can turn ourselves into robots, and we very well might. That's one of the things that was actually the main topic that the human condition, the book, is about. Will we turn ourselves into robots?
Well, my worry was not, it was not in that direction. It was more than thinking, I guess thinking about if that's the kind of humanism that is produced, doesn't that already preclude a lot of bodies that we might otherwise name as human? That is to say, if that kind of willful activity is a necessary condition, a willful address to the polity, right, to the existing constitution. And that then, I think, well, that is actually the humanism, the liberal modern humanism that has produced a lot of violence for centuries and centuries across the globe.
Well,
so if that's the condition of freedom, then that seems really, so that's where I'm thinking, that can't be where Arendt is going, right? Because she wouldn't, or would she, preclude the possibility of humanity for people for whom political activity is structurally impossible.
She would.
She would.
But she would say there are no humans for whom that is necessarily the case.
That's not true, though. Do you actually believe that that's true?
Well, I mean, let me give you the examples that she uses. I mean, you know, these are examples that I've read, I think, very carefully and critically, but also generously, to the extent one wants to be generous. So, in the Origins of Totalitarianism, she mentions three different groups of people in that book that she characterizes as, to a certain extent, not being human. One are certain African tribes, another is the Dutch Boers, and a third are refugees. In all of these instances, there is something about these groups that, in such that the world they've created for the Africans and for the Boers, and the world they've been thrust into for the refugees, has deprived them of certain basic conditions of humanity, either work, labor, or action. In all cases, what she says is, as human beings, they have the potential for these. And it's not that because, in fact, it's not that we should therefore destroy them or anything. It's on the contrary, it's these people who have become, in a sense, who we view, who seem foreign in the extreme, refugees, the Boers, and the Africans. Because they seem inhuman to us, they tempt us with their extermination, and we have to resist that.
So that us and that we there is a very specifically located us and we.
Yes.
So one of the things
is.
that is available now, right, is the knowledge that is an inadequate we, right, or a limited we. So
it always is an inadequate we. She knew it was an inadequate.
So then, if we are actually thinking about this in the present, historicizing the present through Arendt, wouldn't there be some reason then to re-articulate or redefine the kind of humanism, or maybe the different, there's just something really not okay.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand.
Which is very, very analytical way of saying that.
Yeah, it's not okay. You know,
it's not jargon. So it's not okay.
I like that. No, it's better than jargon. You know, the way that this gets played out in the books I read, you know, is to say that we can't define what humans are in any exclusive way. And once you make that move, right, you go down a long road, right? So not only do we have the claim that you can't say whites versus non-whites, right, which we all agree on, or Westerners versus non-Westerners. But how do you make the difference between, you know, humans and psychiatric people, and then humans and animals, and humans and trees, which is why, you know, I wasn't joking before. I mean, there is a big new human rights movement for the protection of the rights of robots and for the right to marry robots. I guess what I'm saying is I'm not trying to defend white male Western rationality. I mean, I am trying to say that we need to risk consensus. We need to risk saying that sometimes humans are more important than animals. And the effort to blur that boundary and say there's really no difference, we have mirror neurons just like elephants, and they can, you know, and really they feel and they whatever. Well, I don't think feeling is enough.
Right. But I guess I would say we have been living with with a very specifically defined version of the human.
Yeah.
And that it has been presented to us as if it was abstract and universally available in ways that have actually produced exactly the opposite. Right?
Yes, I agree with that.
So while elephants or whatever robots are interesting, I'm thinking really about other Homo sapiens in relation to each other. Right? So not necessarily going to that.
But who disagrees with that?
Well, Arendt seems to disagree.
No, I mean, what Arendt says is that people like refugees have been deprived of the chance to act like humans. That people who... But
that is positing a definition of humanity, right? That is positing a particular kind of understanding of the human.
Excuse me, so do you when you want to draw a line between humans and elephants.
Sure, I was just trying to not allow the conversation to.
But what I'm trying to say is I don't think you can avoid that conversation if you're going to make that distinction. And what I'm saying is we actually have to have that conversation. And too many people today are unwilling to have that conversation because any conversation smacks of essentialism or consensus or, exclusion. And I'm saying, no, if you actually want to talk about humans and rights, you actually have to decide what a human is. And I don't think you have to say it's, men, and you don't have to take Arendt's view. You don't have to say that it's people who can work. I'm not going to say that that's the answer, but I think that the move to blur all boundaries, which I associate with globalization in the sort of Heideggerian technology sense, the move towards saying that humans are simply beings that overcome, as Ray Kurzweil says in a really fascinating and underappreciated metaphysical argument in his book, The Singularity is Near, which I've written a bit about. I think you have to take those arguments seriously. And I have. Because I actually think that in order to have a meaningful argument about human beings, we have to actually talk about human beings and what we want to mean by human beings. And I don't have the answer, but I'm having the conversation with people who want to have it.
And we've asked you lots of questions all day today. We've been all over, giving you a hard time.
Thank you so much, Roger.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of fun.